for coming this afternoon on what's almost summer. It feels like here in Philadelphia, doesn't it? Isn't it over 80 today, I think? And so I know being inside at this time of year in the spring with everything in full blossom is it's a bit of a challenge. And I know many of you here are, of course, freshmen from the Pursuit of Excellence learning community. So this is your first spring here at Villanova, so it's probably it's a mark of your virtue that you're here today. So thank you for coming. My name is Colleen Sheehan. I'm director of the Matthew J. Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good. We put on a number of lectures, conferences, reading groups for students and faculty over the course of the year. If anybody's interested, just let us know. And you are more than invited to apply. It's a short application. We have Ryan Junior Fellows. We have Ryan Graduate Fellows. We have two visiting professors, Dr. Oberreiter, right here, who's in your Pursuit of Excellence learning community, and Dr. O'Brien, who also teaches in the Pursuit of Excellence learning community, along with Dr. Satterfield and Mr. Bove. So if anybody wants to know more about that, please just let me know. We'd very much like you to be part of it. Now, I have the privilege today of introducing our speaker, Dr. Aurelian Craiutu. Dr. Craiutu is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Indiana University at Bloomington. He earned his PhD from Princeton University and his undergraduate degree from the Academy of Economic Studies in Bucharest. He was awarded the American Political Science Association Leo Strauss Award for the best dissertation in political philosophy in 1999. And for those of you who don't know, that's incredibly competitive, and it's a very, very fine honor. His dissertation was entitled The Difficult Apprenticeship of Liberty, Reflections on the Political Thought of the French Doctrinaires. Dr. Craiutu's teaching interests include modern and contemporary political theory, democratic theory, and contemporary liberalism, civil society, modern Europe, and modern European intellectual history, as well as French political thought, on the subject of which he's written many, many articles, as well as books. Some of his works include, and these are only some, I had the pleasure of looking over his Vita. I didn't bring it with me because it was too heavy to carry. But I stopped counting in terms of the amount of publications, and publications that have received high honors from various sources. His publications, however, include A Virtue for Courageous Minds, Moderation in French Political Thought. That's out very recently, I believe. The Political Thought of the French Doctrinaires, which was Choice Magazine's 2004 Outstanding Academic Title. So it is really our pleasure to have with us here a wonderful scholar who, by the way, one of his specialties is, of course, Alexis de Tocqueville. And all of you, I think, have been reading Democracy in America, if I'm correct, in your Pursuit of Excellence learning community. Those of you who are in that, I know we have folks who are not in that learning community. And so he's going to talk to us today about Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aurelian Craiutu.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak here and for a very generous introduction. Everything seems better on paper than it is in reality. And I want to come out at the very beginning saying that although I come from Bloomington, Indiana, and I hope you all know why I'm making this point, tomorrow's game against Kentucky, I hope you'll all cheer for Indiana and not for Kentucky. So that's my first thing. I am not a Hoosier, and I do not speak with a Hoosier accent. So I'm of Romanian origin, and I'm proud to be a resident of the great state of Indiana. So tomorrow go Hoosiers, not Kentucky. No, I see some skepticism there. Okay. I take this as a challenge. I have distributed a handout that I would refer to during my talk, and I hope that you have it. Political theories do not use PowerPoint presentations. We have an instinctual fear of anything that has technology and smacks new technology. So we are very old-fashioned guys who still read books, and even worse, we read authors that have been dead for several centuries. So I will be talking today about one of these, Alexis de Tocqueville, and the talk is about a topic that we don't hear political theorists talking too often these days, and that is greatness. It's not a topic that we are accustomed to think about too often, because political theorists tend to speak about politically important issues such as justice, equality, liberty. And if we look at the history of political thought, we see names such as Hobbes, Locke, Marx, and in our age, people like John Rawls, considered by many as the leading contemporary philosopher. He died in 2002, but we consider him contemporary. And they are clear examples of why political theorists have been shy and have not talked about greatness. Only a handful of them dare to speak about what happens to our souls, what happens to our minds in virtue of living in a society that is characterized by equality. What happens to our souls and minds in democratic societies in an age of equality? This is not a topic often discussed, and I think it's all the more important that we turn to Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a Frenchman who came to America in 1831 and spent 9 months here, went back to France, and published Democracy in America in 2 volumes. The first one appeared in 1835, the second one in 1840. Tocqueville is a fascinating subject of conversation for many reasons. It's because this is someone, a Frenchman, who wrote the best book about American democracy. So that's the first paradox that I'm pretty sure should be striking to some of you. We tend to think of Frenchmen and French women as arrogant, haughty, dismissive of American culture and American fast food. That's the image that we have. And yet it was one of them, one of the Frenchmen, who produced arguably the best book on American democracy, and he wrote it 2 centuries ago, almost 2 centuries ago, in 1835. The other thing that is worth mentioning here is that there are many sides to Tocqueville's political thought. There are many Tocquevilles, and they speak to different constituencies. If there's one author today that is loved by both people on the left and on the right, there aren't that many in this category. That one is Alexis de Tocqueville. On the left, he's liked and venerated for his praise of the art of association, civil society, people participating and coming together to pursue things in common. On the right, he is celebrated for his critique of big government. So everyone seems to have a natural affinity for Tocqueville's ideas. And Tocqueville actually was very aware of this complexity of his thought. He disliked political categories, and he declared himself in a letter a liberal of a new kind. He called himself a liberal, which in France is right of the center, unlike in America. And he said that he is a liberal of a new kind who followed no group and had no party behind him. The liberal party to which I belong, he wrote in another letter, does not exist. So when interpreting Tocqueville's writing, I think it's very important to remember that he lived in an age of transition. This was a period that followed the French Revolution that ended in 1794, but the French had this great gift of reopening the wounds or the memory of the past. So the French Revolution started in 1789 and ended when? When did the French Revolution end? Has it ever ended? Some Frenchmen ask. Officially it ended in 1794 after the terror, the episode called the terror that lasted about 16 months. But the fact of the matter is that there had been a recurrent wave of new revolutionary waves in French history, and Tocqueville wrote about this phenomenon and lived in this age. His generation had as task to bring the revolution to an end. There was an endless series, as I mentioned, of revolutionary moments in French history. Napoleon is part of this long history. Napoleon was an incarnation of the French Revolution, and he did not end it. And Tocqueville was obsessed with what could his generation do in order to bring the revolution to an end. He came of age during a period called the Bourbon Restoration. This is a period when France had again the Bourbon family on the throne of the country. The last king was decapitated he was killed by the guillotine in January 1793, and his brother came back on the throne of France in 1814 and then back again in 1815. So it was a period of great change after decades of political stagnation, and it was an age where, try to put yourself into that moment, firm beliefs were dissolved to make way for new ones, and there was a restless and universal questioning of all dogmas, principles, and authorities. Nothing was left standing. And this created in that age a pervasive anxiety, and this seemed contagious on Tocqueville's generation's minds. His his friends and fellows began complaining about the pace of change, and they started denouncing the cheapening of culture and morals during that period. They lived in a period, I would say, comparable to ours today, where things changed at a very rapid pace. And for some of them, the world in which they lived, I'm talking about 1820s, 1830s, seemed marked by growing cupidity, greed, and it was a period of, according to some, anarchy. But it was, above all, for some, the petty ambitions of the people who became exclusively preoccupied with making money. And this is what drew the ire of social critics and writers, such as the writer Stendhal, for example, who spared no energy criticizing the disappearance of great passions and their replacement by what some considered to be mediocre passions, mediocre interests. France, one of them, wrote, risked becoming a nation of dwarfs, a place in which it was impossible for anyone to pursue truly great things and ideas any longer. So Tocqueville felt, and this is the first part of my lecture, like a new Don Quixote, the hero of Cervantes' novel. A new Don Quixote transposed or transplanted into the modern age. It was an age of transition. Don Quixote is known for having imagined wild things and having imagined wonderful things at the same time, but when he was compelled to face reality, he fell flat. It should be no surprise that these complaints resonated with Tocqueville, the new Don Quixote. He was fully aware of living in a new age of transition where nothing was fixed or stable. And he compared himself to a tired wanderer, a seaman in a new world without a good compass, engaged in an adventurous voyage at sea. And this is what he wrote. When I watch everything around me, I see a spectacle unique in history. I see on all sides ancient institutions shaken. Societies tremble on their foundations. Not only political laws, but all that has been considered up to now the foundation of society itself has been questioned. The ground of European civilization trembles. All is shaken. Not only political institutions, but civil institutions, social institutions, and the old society that we know. Tocqueville, who was no conservative at that moment, partly shared the uneasiness of many of his more conservative colleagues about the rise of the middle class, the bourgeoisie. He came from an aristocratic family, but he claimed to be in equilibrium between the past and the future. But he feared that the advent of a new mechanical age, and remember, he did not live to see the new iPads and the Android phones and all the new gadgets that we have today. He feared that the advent of this new mechanical age might bring new forms of servitude that would pose serious threats to freedom in the end. And beginning with the early 1830s, we can find in Tocqueville's works, especially correspondence, harsh words regarding the commercial spirit of the July monarchy, which was characterized by two words uttered by one of Tocqueville's former teachers, and he said, enrichissez-vous, which in English should be translated by get rich or make money. That was the new motto of the generation. Make money, get rich. And Tocqueville was trained to be a lawyer, and this is what will happen to some of you who will go to law school. And I bet some of you are training to become lawyers, right? And you know what happened to Tocqueville once he became a lawyer and once he started practicing law at the Versailles Court of Justice? Do you know what happened to Tocqueville? What will happen to some of you? He got bored. Boredom. He felt stifled. He felt that the career that he had chosen for himself was boring. So he came up with the idea he had to do something with his life. And he was fortunate enough to apply for a grant from the French government to study prisons in America. And this is how he got to this country. He studied the prisons in America, a pretty bleak subject, I should add. But it was a way for him to get out of France and visit something new and do something new. So that was his passport to greatness. Don't forget, if you go to law school, you need this passport after you graduate. Tocqueville took the oath in 1830 to the new king, Louis-Philippe of Orleans. There was a change of dynasty in 1830 in France. The Orleans branch took power. But Tocqueville was never a great lover of the ancient of the new monarchy. And he thought that the new regime that brought to power the middle class openly fostered a universal obsession with material wealth and enthroned self-interest and egoism as reigning principles. And he, as an aristocrat at heart, opposed that. In his recollections, which is his memoirs written in 1850, looking back at 1820s and 1830s, Tocqueville chastised the government of the middle class for being without virtue and without greatness. He described the spirit of the bourgeoisie as, quote, active and industrious, often dishonest, generally orderly, but sometimes rash because of vanity and selfishness, timid by temperament, moderate in all things except for a taste for well-being, and in general mediocre. That was the bourgeoisie of his time. And he felt trapped in a labyrinth of petty incidents and ideas and events that led to what he thought to be a universal shrinkage of all passions that risked transforming the country into a nation of Lilliputians from Gulliver's Travels. Tocqueville conveyed this discontent in March 1841 in a letter to his friend John Stuart Mill, a major English liberal, in which he warned against the all-consuming obsession with money and the increasing commercialization of life. And this is quotation number 1 on the handout that I circulated. He was concerned about the general abasement of mind and taste, the lack of taste brought forth by the rise of the bourgeoisie. And he wrote, "The greatest malady that threatens a people organized as we are is the gradual softening of mores, the abasement of the mind, the mediocrity of tastes. That is where the great dangers of the future lie. One cannot let this nation take up easily the habit of sacrificing what it believes to be its grandeur to its repose, great matters to petty ones." In Tocqueville's eyes, the new discoveries such as steam and the electric telegraph could neither supplant the loss of genuine passions nor justify the dullness of modern society. Technological progress was for him an insufficient replacement of greatness. In another letter to his friend Gustave de Beaumont, who accompanied him during his travel to America, Beaumont, by the way, was a relative of General Lafayette, who is a hero in this country. This is a letter from August 1840. Tocqueville conveyed his longing for a type of greatness that was made impossible by the spirit of the new epoch. And this is quote number 2. I love this quote because I sometimes feel that way as well. "You know what a taste I have for great events and how tired I am of our little democratic and bourgeois pot of soup," he wrote. To his old mentor, Pierre Royer Collard, who after having supported the July monarchy eventually came to distance himself from the politics of the new regime, Tocqueville was even more forceful and critical and could hardly contain his disdain towards his time. "The true nightmare of our period," he wrote in September 1841, "is not perceiving before oneself anything either to love or to hate, but only to despise. By becoming subservient to natural industrial interests, politics had changed its end, being demoted to the ancillary status of the administration of economic questions." It was like an European Union writ large. Everything is done by bureaucrats, Tocqueville thought. And that was the nightmare for him. He loved politics. He loved a great passionate involvement with great ideas. And everything was reduced to a dispute over purely commercial interests. That was the end of greatness for Tocqueville. So the second point of my lecture looks at his search for what he called noble passions. This man felt stifled. He needed something. He came to America. But even that was not enough for him, because the message that he got from America was mixed, as I'll try to explain a bit later. So Tocqueville had another ambition. He wanted to be a politician. And this is something that some of you may contemplate as well in the future. Politics can bring great things, can also wreak great havoc. But it is characteristic of Tocqueville's political nature that he never completely lost faith, hope, and interest in politics, even when politics was reduced to administration, okay? Which should add, along with religion, in his view, was supposed to be a means of creating greatness. At least this is what he learned in America. As Tocqueville acknowledged again in his recollection, if the spirit of the middle class were to be combined with that of aristocracy and of the people, it could create wonders. But left to its own devices and unaided by democratic and aristocratic elements, it is unable to produce anything great or virtuous and could become excessively vulgar. The spirit of the middle class. So Tocqueville was looking to obtain an alchemy, a mixture between aristocratic and democratic elements and passions, and this, he thought, could be achieved through intelligent political action. Politics was for him more than a Pascalian divertissement. I know that you've studied Pascal in this class. Pascal thought that people need distractions in their lives, right? Someone is going hunting, someone else is golfing. There are many golfers in today's society. Why? Because we avoid getting bored, right? We have collegiate athletics sports today. Why? Because we get bored otherwise, right? We need entertainment, we need bread, we need circus. That's exactly what Tocqueville thought could be achieved through better means, through politics. And even in his dark moments, he continued to believe that politics could serve as an effective means of countervailing the predominant influence of the taste for material well-being. Through intelligent political action, Tocqueville argued one might counterbalance the growing privatization of society, people becoming small cells, and politics could enlarge the imagination and ideas of the people. And politics could force people to get out of their rut of daily existence, overcome their isolation, and enlighten themselves by taking care of private affairs. We enlarge our minds and imagination. And in a free nation, Tocqueville argued, individuals must define themselves by a grand purpose, something larger than their narrow individual lives, something that can be given only by noble political passions. So what Tocqueville understood by noble political passions can be surmised by examining the words of praise he lavished in another book, The Old Regime and the Revolution, upon those who took part in the events of the summer of 1789 in France. This was the opening moments of the French Revolution. And this is what Tocqueville wrote there. People had real convictions in 1789 in France. Everybody followed his own convictions boldly, passionately. They did not look for enjoyment of their well-being and had no interest in business interests. They were sincerely interested in public affairs, and he admired his predecessors because they pursued higher and noble passions than the desire for well-being and money. And he always placed the true life of action and the genuine exchange of opinions above the mere pursuit of economic interests. And this is what he said. This is quote number 3 on my handout. He acknowledged this. There are moments, he confessed to his friend Gustave de Beaumont in March of 1838, when I fear becoming mad in a matter of Don Quixote. My mind is completely crammed with a heroism that is hardly of our time, and I fall flat when I come out of these dreams and find myself face to face with reality. Was there any outlet left for Tocqueville's mind and soul, crammed with a heroism that was stifled by the ethos of his bourgeois times? Tocqueville could rely only on one single truth, I think. He had to acknowledge that democracy was irreversible, and that is the conclusion of democracy in America. Democracy was in full spate. Its progress was inevitable, could not be stopped. It was willed by God, he says in the introduction to Democracy in America. He realized that to oppose democracy would be foolish and absurd. But democracy, he understood early on, was to be compared to an impure river, something that needed dikes to contain and regulate its sometimes impetuous flow. Democracy, in other words, had to be educated, tamed, purified, moderated in order to show its true advantages. Might then the task of educating and moderating democracy have given Tocqueville those adventures that he always longed for? And the answer is yes. That was the task that the new Don Quixote took upon himself in trying to create something great with his own life and with his own country. So that's point number 3 on the handout, and I'd like to turn the discussion towards this important topic, which is central to the message of democracy in America: the need to educate, moderate, and purify democracy seen as an impure river. Tocqueville was tempted to transfer greatness from action to theory, and he found the task of moderating democracy intellectually and politically challenging. He clearly stated his goals not only in the carefully crafted introduction to Democracy in America, but also in the equally important preface to Volume 1 of The Old Regime and the Revolution, and that's the book he published in 1856. And this is quote number 4 on the handout. Today, he writes, humanity is driven by an unknown force which we can hope to moderate but not to defeat. This force, he mentioned, he remarked, pose a number of significant threats to freedom, including excessive preoccupation, as I said, with private individual interest, narrow individualism, isolation, and also what he called democratic despotism. And this is a new form of despotism. It's a kind of a form of welfare state that takes the trouble of giving us all the means of living, provided that we don't think. Tocqueville argued, and this is again quote number 4, the second half of the quote, that the task of those who are called to govern modern society was, this is a seminal passage from the Introduction to Democracy in America, was to instruct democracy, if possible to reanimate its beliefs, to purify its morals, to regulate its movement, to substitute little by little the science of affairs for its inexperience and knowledge of its true interest. And he concluded to adapt its government to time and place, to modify it according to circumstances and men. This is the task of modern legislators in modern society, according to Tocqueville. In its details, the task of moderating democracy proved, however, to be much more difficult than in theory. A short fragment, rarely quoted and never published by Tocqueville, it can be found only among his notes, reveals Tocqueville's state of mind when contemplating this new society, the democratic society in 1835. A society that did not exist in Europe at the time. It existed in America only, and Europeans did not know what to do with it. And this is quote number 5 on the handout. He writes, democracy, exclamation mark. Don't you notice that these are the waters of the deluge? Deluge. Don't you see them advancing by slow and irresistible effort? If you retreat, the flow continues its march. If you run away, it flows behind you. Instead of seeking to erect powerless dikes, let us rather try to build this sacred ark which must carry humankind on this shoreless ocean. Imagine how beautiful this is in French. If it's so beautifully written in English, in French it's even better. How strange, after all, that Tocqueville would compare democracy to the water of the deluge, the flood, the biblical flood. What is particularly striking in this passage is not so much the reference to the deluge, but Tocqueville's biblical reference to building the sacred ark, which could save modern men from the fury of the natural force called democracy. The task was urgent and had its own promise of greatness, if it was to be accomplished well. And this appealed to the Frenchman, the new Don Quixote, who was thirsting for great adventures, spiced up with a touch of danger. His new political science, and that's the great ambitions undergirding democracy in America, to offer a new political science, was supposed to offer the blueprint for building this sacred ark. And the biblical overtones of the fragment quoted earlier reveal Tocqueville's belief in his soteriological calling and mission. He saw himself almost as a new Messiah, Tocqueville, called to save mankind by providing this new ark, his new political science, in order for people to live peacefully with this new monster called democracy. In Tocqueville's view, democracy therefore had to be educated and moderated because it contained in itself contradictory tendencies and deep-seated antinomies, contradictions, that risk transforming it into an enemy of freedom and civilization. And the dichotomy, the contrast between equality and liberty is a fundamental theme throughout democracy in America. Democratic nations, he wrote, may produce great things, but very rarely great men. And women, I should add. The new democratic social state, he wrote in Democracy in America, awakens ambitions and puts it to sleep, gives great desires and finally leads you to be content with little. As he wrote in a letter to a reviewer of Volume 1 of Democracy in America, the new social democratic state which produced great goods also gave birth to a number of dangerous tendencies. And this is quote number 6 on the handout. It's an important quote because it reveals the state of mind of Tocqueville in addressing the issue of purifying democracy and educating it. These seeds, democratic seeds, if left to grow unchecked, would produce, it seemed to me, a steady lowering of the intellectual level of society with no conceivable limit. And this would bring in its train the materialism of mores and finally universal slavery. I thought I saw that mankind was moving in this direction, and I viewed the prospect with terror. It was essential, I thought, for all men of goodwill to join in exerting the strongest possible pressure in the opposite direction. So what do we make of this passage? If left to its natural tendencies, Tocqueville believed, democracy would threaten freedom of thought and would foster what he called in Volume 1 the tyranny of majority, conformism. In any democratic regime, he argued, there are two distinctive and contrary tendencies in all democratic societies. One tendency leads people directly to independence, and unchecked and unregulated might even push them into anarchy, while the other tendency surreptitiously leads them to servitude by various ways that one can foresee. Unfortunately, Tocqueville warned, the corrosive effects of equality did not stop there. Taken individually, those who live in a democracy tend to be weak individuals and ready to withdraw within the narrow confines of their private interests. Left to its own inclination, democracy does not cultivate these passions, the great passions, and sometimes, as we saw, even stifles them. And Tocqueville also understood that the constant instability of constant change of the democratic social state has long-lasting effects on how people think, feel, how they connect with each other, what they dream about, and what they desire, what they long for. It shrinks their mental and intellectual and spiritual horizon, he thought, by making them prisoners of the here and now, living in the present, disconnected from the past, projected into an unclear future, engulfed in the pursuit of material pleasures without any concerns for larger vistas. The citizens living in democratic societies live the tumultuous and constantly vexed life which equality gives to them, and in so doing, he warned, they all contract the habits of the industrial and commercial classes. Their minds, he notes, would take a serious, calculating and positive turn which would make them pragmatic to the point of forgetting that there is more to life than getting rich. He attributed this turn to pragmatism to equality, which, he says, does not destroy imagination in this way, but limits it, shrinks it, and permits it to fly only while skimming the earth. On many passages in Volume 2 of Democracy in America, Tocqueville expressed serious concerns about the cultural and intellectual effects of uneducated democracy. He was concerned, as I said, with the quality of the human souls, but he was also interested in reforming political institutions. That's why I said he's that kind of thinker that we rarely encounter today, because today we want to reform society mostly by reforming institutions. It's very difficult to present a political agenda for reform that takes into account reforming people's souls. That would be labeled as communism, even worse, as moderation. That's what happens when you try to reform this aspect of our lives. And Tocqueville was interested in manners, in how people connect to each other. And he didn't think that democracy creates good manners, and they have to be educated and purified. Tocqueville was also concerned that democracy fosters what he saw as homogeneity and monotony. Life in democratic societies, he claimed, is sometimes monotonous. Democratic individuals, he says, tend to be all alike and do and think about similar things. They have many passions and goals and pursue many various paths, but they all end in the love of wealth or a form of them. And of course, Tocqueville was deeply concerned about what he saw as the homogenization of society. And he writes on various places that what's disappearing from human species is variety. People all look the same, do the same things, speak the same. If you were to live today, you would notice how many words like we use in our language today. There's no phrase without a like in my students' vocabulary. I know this is not the case at Villanova, but at Indiana, my students always use like at least 5 times in a phrase. I always stop counting at 5. So that's something that Tocqueville was concerned about it, and he also wanted to see people pursuing noble enterprises. And if you look at quote number 7 here, he talks about the shrinkage of ambition here, and he calls it vulgar here. He writes, ambition is not more moderate, but effeminate, which means weakened. It is not ambition that is small, courage is. Ambition is rather vulgar than small. Vulgar, that is the word of my chapter. So what are the means of avoiding living a vulgar life for Tocqueville? And how could a one man be enough to build the holy ark capable of purifying and elevating democracy? And this brings me back to Tocqueville's Science of Politics, which is the 4th point on my agenda today. This is central to understanding Tocqueville's message. This is a man who had an ambitious agenda. He did not write the book to get tenure, as we all do today. He had a greater ambition. He wanted to provide a new political science, which meant a new theoretical framework to save mankind. I'm not sure that I would want to do that much, but I admire his range and his vision. It is somewhat ironical that Tocqueville, a restless mind, never really despaired of the possibility of moderating democracy, even in France. And if you look at a famous statement in the Introduction to Democracy in America, he wrote, a new political science is needed for a world altogether new. A new political science is needed for a new world. And the 2 volumes of Democracy in America do illustrate very clearly Tocqueville's confidence in the power of his new science of politics to offer valuable guidelines for moderating democracy. Tocqueville provided a very nuanced discussion about the means that can be used to this effect. And he has a very simple idea, which is still valid for us today. And I would like to share it with you because I think it might be useful to reflect on it for a moment. Tocqueville realized that if any one set of interests at work in society were ever allowed to reign absolutely unchecked, society would be deprived of one of its leading principles of social improvement. You need a competition between various principles, various ideas, various interests in society. And this is what he understood. This is how he understood the necessity for pluralism that makes freedom possible. Tocqueville reached a similar conclusion with regard to the spirit of commercialism, and this applies to our life today. If left unchecked, commercialism would probably bring society to ruin. That's why in a society in which everyone wants to go to law school and business school, we need to encourage those students who still want to read Aristotle and Plato and want to study the classics. There will be no jobs for them, for sure, but this is all the more important to redress the balance. Tocqueville was concerned with the balance. Okay? In a society where everyone is concerned with making money, we should encourage people to study music, precisely to redress the balance. And he understood that democratic societies can survive if they promote this balance. And this is a seminal quote, which is the longest on the handout, number 8, which I think provides the wager, or how should I put it, the balance sheet that he offers us. It's a seminal chapter from a seminal fragment from a seminal chapter in Volume 1 of Democracy in America. And I will take the liberty of reading it because it's fundamental to understanding Tocqueville's message. So he says, what do you want? What do you ask of society and its government? Do you want to give the human spirit a certain nobility, a generous fashion of envisioning the things of this world? Do you want to inspire in men a sort of contempt for material goods? Do you desire to bring about or to maintain profound convictions and prepare great devotions? Is it a matter for you of polishing mores, of elevating manners, of making the arts shine? Do you want poetry, fame, or glory? Do you claim to organize a people in a way to act strongly on all others? Do you intend to attempt great undertakings and whatever the results of its efforts to leave an immense trace in history? If such, in your view, is the principal object that men must propose for themselves in society, do not opt for the government of democracy, he wrote. It would not lead you surely to that goal. But, on the other hand, if it seems useful to you to divert the intellectual and moral activity of man towards the necessities of material life and to use it to produce well-being, if reason appears to you more profitable to men than genius, if your object is not to create heroic virtues but peaceful habits, if you like to see vices more than crimes, and you prefer to find fewer great actions on the condition of encountering fewer cases of heinous crimes, if instead of acting within the bosom of a brilliant society, it is enough for you to live in the midst of a prosperous society, if finally in your view the principal object of a government is not to give the entire body of the nation the most strength or the most glory possible, but to provide for each of the individuals that make up the society the most well-being and to avoid the most misery, then equalize conditions and constitute the government of society. So the choice is clear. Do you want a good red Chateauneuf du Pape or you want a six-pack of Bud Light? What do you want? Can you have both? That's the question. Can you have both? Can you still have a good expensive bottle of a red Côte d'Iron Chateauneuf du Pape and good beer, or you are always bound to choose between mediocre choices? The unique charm of this passage comes from its ambiguity. Tocqueville doesn't tell us what to do. Tocqueville's suggestion here is that a good society needs a blend of both, a blend of Chateauneuf du Pape and a blend of Belgian beer. Okay? That's the best in the world. And he believed that if democracy were to survive and prosper, it would need to draw on aristocratic elements and persons. He calls these aristocratic elements, but it was not about aristocracy. What he understood by aristocratic persons, he wrote in a note, are permanent and legal associations. And these are townships, counties, and voluntary and temporary associations. He called them aristocratic ones because they are forms that allow people to pursue things together but also bring limits to what they have and they can do. And he also, among aristocratic elements, included constitutional and judicial forms. He thought lawyers are like an aristocratic caste in modern society, and they perform a vital role. So the principal merit of these forms was to serve as a barrier and slow down and give people time to recollect and get their bearings. But then after insisting on the need for these aristocratic elements, he talked about using democratic elements as well. So here's Tocqueville, the balance man. And quote number 9 is important because he comes to acknowledge here that in order to moderate democracy, you can't go back in the past. You can't wipe the traces of the new society. He writes, use democracy to moderate democracy. It is the only path to salvation that is open to us. Use democracy to moderate democracy. To discern the feelings, the ideas, the laws which, without being hostile to the principles of democracy, without having a natural incompatibility with democracy, can nevertheless correct its troublesome tendency and will blend with it while modifying it. So think about this. Use democracy to moderate democracy, but also use aristocratic elements to spice up this mixture. This is Tocqueville's balance. Among the effective democratic remedies to democratic ills, Tocqueville listed, and this is interesting, education, freedom of the press, religion, decentralization, local liberties, and election of functionaries. Religion was an interesting story in Tocqueville's account. Religion was supposed to purify and regulate the love of wealth and materialism in modern society. And he understood that democratic legislator must strive to elevate the souls and cultivate what he calls a taste for the infinite, a sentiment of greatness, and a love of immaterial pleasures. Only freedom, he concluded, can tear people from the worship of mammon and the petty daily concerns of their personal affairs, and teach them always to see and feel the nation above and besides them. So Tocqueville summed up his recipe for moderating democracy by concluding, do not adopt one single social principle, however good it appears to be. Do not use any single form of government. Use a balance of them. So the key principle was preventing any one set of interests and ideas from rising to absolute dominion in society. Tocqueville also had something important to say about spiritualizing democracy as a way of achieving a new form of greatness. Quote number 10 is something that I always like to bring to the attention of my students because it's something that we tend to forget these days. Tocqueville writes, no one is less of a dreamer than the citizen of a democracy. All the men who live in democratic times contract more or less the intellectual habits of the industrial or commercial classes. Their minds take a serious calculating and positive turn. And then in quote number 11, Tocqueville was worried about the superficiality and the mediocrity of democratic life. And he understood that we who live in democratic societies suffer from a form of deficit attention disorder. And he diagnosed it as such, even if he was not a doctor at the time. This is what he said, quote 11. The democratic individual does everything with haste, contents himself with approximation, and never stops except for a moment to consider each of his actions. His curiosity is at once satiable and satisfied at little cost, or he values knowing a lot quickly rather than knowing anything well. He hardly has the time, and he soon loses the taste to go deeper. The habit of inattention must be considered as the greatest vice of the democratic mind. That's why he believed that legislators in democracies must, without respite, lift up the souls and keep them pointed towards heaven, to instill in people the sentiment of for the grand, for the great, and the love for non-material pleasures. So this brings me to the conclusion here, which I labeled Tocqueville's unorthodox moderation. So this is an aristocrat who is resigned, and he admits that democracy cannot be reversed. But this is someone who searched for a middle, as I pointed out earlier, between aristocracy and democracy, and he came up with his own version of moderation. He admired in America the art of self-government, and he really loved this country for that matter. But he also thought that there is more to liberty than self-government. And he wrote about mediocrity. And this is something that I would like to share with you because it's something that we no longer fear today. We are concerned with freedom, with being left alone to pursue our interests. We think that we know what's best in our interest, and we are no longer interested in this concept that almost has disappeared from the radar screen of political theories, mediocrity. And this is what he wrote. This is the last quotation on handout number 12. And this is what he feared. And this is, I think, what I would fear today most as well. I admit that I fear boldness much less for democratic societies than mediocrity of desires. What seems to me to fear is that amid the small incessant preoccupation of private life, ambition may lose its impetus and its grandeur, that human passions may become calmer and lower at the same time, so that each day the bearing of the social body may become more tranquil and less elevated. Tocqueville was aware that this new type of greatness, there was a new type of greatness possible in democratic societies, but it will not be similar to the one in aristocratic societies. And he, I think, to the very end remained an ambivalent thinker. Was he a friend of democracy, or was he a critic of democracy? And scholars have disagreed on this topic. I wanted in my lecture to shift away the focus from this rather sterile question to the issue of moderating democracy. And I think that Tocqueville understood that we can no longer hope for a harmonious synthesis of all the good things in life. You can't have everything. You can't have Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which is a great wine, and a good beer at the same time. It's very difficult to have both. You can't have great literature and great technological advances at the same time. It's difficult. He ended Volume 2 of Democracy in America on a melancholic tone, contemplating with mixed feelings the new world in which all extreme become milder, and we are settling for a middling that is once less high and less low, less brilliant and less obscure than what used to be seen in the world. Although the spectacle of universal uniformity chilled him, he refused to endorse a philosophy of resignation. He was not a conservative lamenting the bygone ages. He did not subscribe to fatalism. He was, in my view, a repressed romantic, a Don Quixote, as I said, perpetually aware of the distance between the real and ideal. And that's why he continues to challenge and surprise us. I'm constantly for myself an insolvable enigma, he wrote. And my question then is, why should we try to present a one-dimensional view of this wonderful thinker that has inspired many generations of readers? And I would end by saying that this is someone who defies our black and white political categories, and it is precisely for that reason that we still read him today. There are many Tocquevilles, and I invite you to discover your own one, especially if you read French. It's one of the great masters of French language. And if not, try to read one with translation on the side. But the one that I love most, the Tocqueville that I love most, reminds us that we should never despair of living in democracy, and that we always have a chance of achieving greatness, even in the midst of our democratic times. Thank you very much.